My name is Renee Hatcher. I'm so thrilled to be able to participate and facilitate this event today to talk about and really hopefully expose so many of you who are not really aware of the story of Fred Hampton and all he's done for the city of Chicago, and certainly his work and his legacy with the Black Panther Party, and to have an opportunity to really talk about and get into his life and his legacy. And it's so fitting to do this as we honor MLK Day yesterday, and think about where we are in this moment in our country. Obviously, we've seen this past year so much that has happened, but a renewed and the largest both protests and civic engagement, standing up for racial justice in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. We've seen, again, what has been really difficult for many of us in seeing a coup in our nation's capital, but really very much animated by a call and a return on the foundations of white supremacy in this country. And so to think about this moment in terms of what it means, what MLK's legacy means, but also in thinking about, I think, some of the similarities between MLK and both Fred Hampton. Many people don't realize that Martin Luther King, like many others who stood up for civil rights, were demonized while he was doing his work and while he was alive. And so much, I think, of what he's been portrayed misses out on the fullness of his contributions and also what he stood for. And similarly, I think the same thing can be said of Fred Hampton, not fully understanding the legacy and the work of the Black Panther parties, of the contributions of Fred Hampton in particular. So I'm very pleased that we'll have an opportunity to hear from our esteemed guest today to learn more about Fred Hampton. And before I introduce him, I just wanted to kind of get us going and show a few clips and hear directly from both MLK as well as Fred Hampton, and then just speak a little bit to, I think, the similar fight that they were fighting, and maybe just the fact that their tactics were different, but ultimately what they saw in their work was a much more deep engagement of economic justice, of radical democracy, of giving folks what they need in this country. And so we'll hear from them, and then I will introduce our speaker and we'll get started.
I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside. That will be only an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring.
And now, so that was just a short clip from MLK's Beyond Vietnam speech, one of his seminal speeches. And now I'd just like briefly to play a clip from Fred Hampton.
And the Black Panther chairman of the state of Illinois, Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton. And a lot of people don't understand the Black Panther Party relationship with white mother country radicals. A lot of people don't even understand that word that they're using a lot. But what we're saying is that there are white people in the mother country that are for the same type of things that we are for stimulating revolution in the mother country. And we said that we work with anybody, form coalitions with anybody that has revolution on their mind. We're not a racist organization because we understand that racism is an excuse used for capitalism. And we know that racism is just it's a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people. And we're going to have to put it back in the hands of the people. Everybody in the state of Illinois is going to have to be involved or even around the revolution because we're going to have one. We're going to have to do more than talk. We're going to have to do more than listen. We're going to even have to do more than learn. We're going to have to start practicing, and that's very hard. We have to start learning, and you learn through practice. We got to start making mistakes, and you learn through making mistakes. We got to start getting out there with the people. And a lot of times we think we're better than the people. That's an insult, and that's criminal. Think you're better than the people. We got to get together and learn where it's at. It's going to take a lot of hard work. Education for children is something else. You ought to dig on it. Every sister in this audience.
Okay, I'll stop there. But what I wanted to point your attention to was really this radical revolution of values, right? And both King and Fred Hampton spoke to this need to rethink and to completely obliterate racism. They talk about materialism, or in the case of Fred Hampton, he talks about capitalism and the way in which workers are exploited, as well as militarism, which also was a big tenet and something that the Panthers spoke to. So in thinking about both King and Fred Hampton, I think that there's a lot to be gained and a lot to be learned from their legacy, from their work. And with that, I will introduce our speaker who will speak more to the life and legacy of Fred Hampton. So we are very fortunate to be joined by Jeffrey Haas today. Jeffrey was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, and attended the University of Michigan and the University of Chicago Law School. He was one of the founders of the People's Law Office. Many of you should be familiar with PLO, or the People's Law Office, here in Chicago. He and the co-founders founded the People's Law Office in 1969, where he worked on movement, criminal defense, and police brutality civil rights cases from 1969 to 2002. With his partners, he represented the families of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in a 13-year civil rights case that exposed the FBI-led Cointelpro conspiracy that resulted in the Chicago police raid on December 4th, 1969, that essentially was the assassination of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. He also represented persons charged after the prison rebellions in Attica in 1971 and Pontiac prison rebellion in 1978. He's the author of The Assassination of Fred Hampton, How the FBI and the Chicago Police Murdered Black Panther. And with that, I will pass over privileges to Jeffrey, and he'll go into a presentation more about Fred Hampton.
Thank you, Renee, for that introduction. And thank you for showing the clips of Dr. King and Fred Hampton. I always listen or watch on Dr. King Day a couple of the speeches he gave, the ones you showed, the Riverside Church, and I'm amazed. I'd watched them last night, and I was amazed that he could have been speaking today. He talks about the twin evils, or the triple evils of racism, materialism, and militarism, and I think they're as more to the front today almost than they were 50 years ago, and so his words ring out, and his the radical nature of what he was asking or demanding, a different kind of society. As he said, throwing a coin to a beggar is not the same thing as changing the edifice that creates a beggar. And I think that's the kind of thing, the kind of systemic change that Fred Hampton was also talking about. So I'm gonna go now to, can we get my slides up here? Yeah. So I was one of the as stated, I was one of the founders of People's Law Office in 1969. We were fresh, somewhat new out of law school. We started People's Law Office in a what had been a sausage shop on Halsted and Webster Street in Chicago. And then we still had the sausage awning over our office for the first 2 years. We were created it to a large extent because Fred Hampton and the leader of the Young Lords, Cha-Cha Jimenez, and leaders of the Young Patriots all were coming together in a coalition in Chicago, and they said, we need lawyers. The police are harassing us. They're arresting us every day for selling newspapers, for having demonstrations. So we created the People's Law Office to some extent to serve the movement. This is the cover of the book that I wrote, and it's a memoir about my affiliation or knowing Fred and the 13-year legal saga that we spent exposing how Fred was killed.
I'm not sure if everyone can see the slides. Can you ensure that your screen is being shared?
Oh, yeah, I want to make sure. Where is it? It was on there a minute ago. We did it before. Can you see them now?
No, if you can click the green button at the bottom, they should come back up.
Wait a minute. I'm looking for that. Hold on a minute.
Test. Test.
I don't see. Okay. Now, let's see. Okay. Does this work?
So if you hit the share screen button at the bottom on Zoom, it should give you an option to just select the slides there.
Okay. How do I, unfortunately the slide isn't in the, I gotta get the slide into the share thing. Is it doing it now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, sorry. All right, well, they didn't miss much except the title to the talk today. Anyway, this is the book that I wrote about our legal efforts, our 13-year legal effort to expose what happened to Fred Hampton. And so a little bit about who Fred Hampton was. Here's some early pictures. The one on the bottom is 10 years old. Then it's Fred as chairman of the Black Panther Party. I learned a lot about Fred Hampton. His family had moved from Haynesville, Louisiana, to Chicago in the 40s. They settled in Maywood, which is a working class suburb of Chicago. And Fred grew up, he had a brother and a sister. And what was kind of unique about Fred was he actually had a speech defect. And to overcome that, he practiced going to church and listening to the preacher and picked up some of the rhythm, and he eventually memorized all the speeches of Dr. King and Malcolm X. And he also was so quick with his mind, he was sort of the king of the nines, as people said. The other thing about Fred was he just had a great simpatico for other people. And so when he was 10 years old, he used to gather the kids in the neighborhood and make breakfast for all the kids, some of whom didn't have a lot of food at home. So I like to say Fred started his own Breakfast for Children program when he was 10 years old. And Fred was, I think one of the qualities of Fred Hampton was he just couldn't accept injustice anywhere. When he was in high school in Maywood, he actually led a walkout because Black girls were not considered for homecoming queens, which a lot of people said that what's the big deal here. But Fred said, you know, I don't accept that. He led a similar walkout to get more Black teachers and administrators. And Fred was somebody also, when they had racial issues at the high school, the principal actually invited Fred in to help talk to the kids. He had an amazing way to move people. He became the head of the NAACP, the suburban NAACP, while he was still in high school. And that was organized and went from like 50 people to 250 people. Also, there was no recreation center for Black kids in Maywood. There was a pool in the summer for white kids at a nearby suburb, but it was private. So Black kids could not go there. So Fred led a march to the Maywood City Council and demanded that they set up a recreation center. When the police saw so many young Black people coming, they tear gassed them. Even though Fred was negotiating to get a bigger room, and then they tear gassed, wouldn't let the other people in. And when the other people ran away and broke some windows, they charged Fred with mob action, even though he was inside trying to negotiate for a bigger room. Fred became better and better known as a speaker. He introduced Stokely Carmichael, the head of SNCC in Chicago, and there he met Bobby Rush, who was also part of SNCC. And when Rush went out to the West Coast and they decided to open a Panther chapter in Chicago, they said they made Fred Hampton the chair because he was such a good speaker. And the Panthers opened their office in Chicago in the fall of 1969. And the Panthers grew very rapidly. They had a Breakfast for Children program. They had a medical health clinic. They sold newspapers. And everybody in the Panthers, Fred included, he would show up for the breakfast program at 6:30 in the morning, making the breakfast or serving the kids or talking to their parents. And I remember one of the things he said, these mothers may not know might not like socialism, but they sure like the Breakfast for Children program. And raised the question, why do the Panthers have to, why isn't society, why isn't the city providing kids with breakfast before they go to school? So the Panthers were growing. They were attracting young Black college students. They were attracting people on welfare. They were attracting some gang members. And Fred became to get not just a local, but a national reputation. And he was eventually followed not only by the Chicago police, but also by the FBI, and he was put on an agitator list. I just want to say one more thing that kind of connects the Panthers in many ways with the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, we know that the Panthers did believe in armed self-defense and defending themselves, but their program was, they had a 10-point program which included freedom to determine the destiny of the Black community, full employment, an end to capitalist exploitation, decent housing, informed education, exemption from Black men, an end to police brutality and murder, freedom for Black prisoners, Black juries, land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. So they were demanding a new society, but not just for Black people, they were demanding it for all people. And if Black people could get that, and just as Black Lives Matter and other groups are demanding today, then all people would get that. As I said, the police and the Panthers, the police and the FBI were very hostile to the Panthers. The Panthers did have a very strong rhetoric about off the pig, which I think for them meant get hostile police out of the community. But I think it was also seen as a threat by the police themselves. And so this issue of the right of self-defense and the Panthers demanding their rights, they actually started by following the police around in Oakland. So there were 3 raids on the Panther office, 2 by the police and 1 by the FBI. And in the FBI, when they actually had a plan, they'd sent a fugitive into the Panther office, and then they would raid the office claiming that they were harboring a fugitive. The fugitive actually worked for the FBI and was never there, but they used this in Chicago and then a few days later in Los Angeles. So there were shots, the police came in, they urinated on the cereal and other foods that had been gathered for the Breakfast for Children program. So there was a lot of hate between the police who felt threatened because ending police brutality and community control of police were very much the patterns of, very much what the Panthers were striving for. So because of one of these raids and because the office had been shot up, they were on Madison Street in 2340. The Panthers decided to buy their office. Now, when this started, you saw the speeches that Fred gave, and I was at one of those speeches when he came out of prison, and he talked about, predicted, this was in August of 1969, and he said, I'm not gonna die slipping on a piece of ice, I'm not gonna die of a heart attack, I'm gonna die doing the things I wanna do. And he challenged everyone there. And I was just a little bit older than Fred. And he said, if you're asked to make a commitment at the age of 20, and you say, I'm too young to make that my commitment, I don't want to die, Fred Hampton said, well, you're dead already. So it's about struggling. And as he said, dare to struggle. Damn it, if you don't struggle, peace to you if you're willing to fight for it. And I think Fred had that ability to mobilize people, to bring together this coalition of the young lords that had been a Puerto Rican street gang that were fighting gentrification, the young patriots who were in Uptown, who had the same bad housing, bad schooling, and bad education that Black people were also experiencing. And he brought those people together. And so I think he was seen as a threat more with his mouth and his ability to organize than because of any violence that he or the Panthers may have caused. So anyway, they wanted to buy their office. I had, before I started People's Law Office, had worked a year or two at Legal Aid, and I knew a little bit about housing law. So on December 2nd, I went over and met with Fred to get him to sign the contract. We had the money and they were gonna buy it. And I went into the Panther office and I saw Fred. And in my book, I talk a little bit about what it was like to be at that speech I just heard, but I went into the office and Fred was just in a give and take with other members. And he was like a modern day rapper, just with so much energy back and forth, be at the breakfast program on time, sell your share of newspapers. And it was like people lived off the energy they got just interacting with Fred Hampton. So that was Tuesday, December 2nd. And I said, I'll be back when I get the contract papers written up. About 36 hours later, 7 o'clock in the morning on December 4th, my law partner knocked on my door, back door, and I opened and he said, the chairman is dead. And I couldn't believe it because Fred gave the rest of us so much life. And he said, yes, the chairman was killed. There was a police raid this morning at 4:30. And I was stunned. And he said, well, I said, what are you going to do? He said, well, I'm going to go and with Bobby Rush and to identify the body. And then we're going to the apartment because the police left it open. And he said, what are you going? And I said, well, what can I do? And he said, well, the 3 of the survivors are at the police station. It would be good to go interview them. So that morning on December 4th, I went and interviewed and spoke to Fred Hampton's fiance, Deborah Johnson, who was 8.5 months pregnant with their son, and 2 other Panthers. And so I walked into the interview room that morning and I saw Deborah Johnson in her checkered nightgown. And basically, I'm just gonna read what it was cold in the tiny windowless interview room at the Wood Street Police Station. I looked across the wooden table at the large boned woman with a short afro who was shaking and sobbing. Deborah Johnson, patterned nightgown, outlined her protruding belly, revealing her pregnancy. Fred never really woke up, she said. He was lying there when they pulled me out of the bedroom. She paused. And then I asked. Two pigs went back into the bedroom. One of them said, he's barely alive, he'll barely make it. I heard 2 shots, then I heard, he's good and dead now. Fred's fiance looked at me with sad, swollen eyes. What can you do? I couldn't think of any reply. I couldn't bring Fred back to life. And so that's what she told me on the morning of December 4th. Meanwhile, my partners were going into the apartment where the raid took place. And there, just as she is, that's the bed where Deborah and Fred were lying when the police came in. And that's Fred Hampton's blood in the blood on the bed. And that's where he was assassinated, in that room. The police did not cordon off the area so that we had access to it, to gather the information, to look at the trajectory of the bullet holes. They dragged Fred from the bed and actually literally pulled him out in the hallway like he was a trophy to show that they had killed him. And this is a photograph. A reporter who happened to be driving by heard about the raid on the police radio and took this picture of the smiling police carrying out the body of Fred Hampton, carrying down the steps of 2337 West Monroe. So while I was interviewing the survivors, my partners were going to the apartment and were gathering evidence. Meanwhile, and what we were discovering was that all of what the police and Hanrahan, the prosecutor, were saying, they were surprised a volley of shots came from the Panthers as soon as they entered, and that they shot back in self-defense. And they even claimed they didn't know it was a Panther apartment, but they went there with a machine gun, a carbine, and several handguns. Not exactly what you would do if you were looking for a small amount of marijuana. So they knew it was a Panther apartment. And the Panthers, because we were able to get to the apartment and draw dowels showing the trajectory, these are people from the community. And the Panthers took the community through the apartment to show them what happened, to show them where the bullets came from, to show them the bloody mattress where Fred was killed. And what we discovered when we gathered the bullets and the shell casings and the trajectories was the police had fired 90 shots towards the Panthers. The only Panther shot came from Mark Clark, who was at the front door, and it was a reflexive shot after he had been shot in the heart because his bullet went up into the ceiling of the hallway. So meanwhile, the police were saying the Panthers started it. They charged everybody with attempted murder. We had to go to court to defend them. Eventually, charges were dropped. But we weren't satisfied, and we said, we've got to find out what happened. So we filed a civil suit against Hanrahan, who was the prosecutor to whom the police were assigned, and all the raiders, and the laboratory which had phonied up the evidence and the phony investigation. And we ran into a very hostile Judge Perry, who was an 85-year-old from Alabama, who made everything we did threatening to us and threw out our case because he said the charges we were making were alarming rather than the conduct we were describing. He dismissed the case and we had to get it reinstated at the Seventh Circuit. But meanwhile, a couple of things had come out. It came out that there was an informant who was involved with a Chicago policeman in the murder of drug dealers in Gary. And the newspapers hit when one of these people were killed. And it turned out that FBI informant had been the head of security in the Panther Party. And we knew him, and his name was William O'Neill. It also came out as a result of a burglary at an FBI office that there was a federal program called Cointelpro, which targeted the Black Panthers. And so with that, we started asking for discovery. We started demanding documents. We started demanding FBI documents. And one that came out that was never intended to be seen was this document here. And it's difficult to read the writing, but basically this the informant O'Neill drew up this floor plan for the special agent Roy Mitchell and gave it to Mitchell. And this is the floor plan of the apartment. This is the entranceway. This is the front. This is the living room. This is where Mark Clark was shot and killed. This is where there were 3 Panthers sleeping. And Joe Gorman took his machine gun and stitched the wall and hit all 3 people here. One was Doc Satchel, who had 5 bullets in his abdomen and somehow survived. And back here is the bed where Hampton and Clark were, and where Fred Hampton and Deborah Johnson were sleeping. And when we noticed the trajectory of the police bullets who came in here and came in from the back, they generally went towards Fred Hampton's bed. So it turned out that the floor plan the FBI had devised was given to the raiders, was given to Hanrahan's office. So they went in there knowing the layout, knowing where Hampton would be. And in fact, that's where he was assassinated. Another thing that we discovered in the lawsuit was about the Cointelpro program, their own documents. And I know the one on the left's difficult, but the objectives of the Cointelpro program, their own stated, were prevent the coalition of militant Black groups, prevent, and that should be prevent instead of present, excuse me, prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the Black nationalist movement, prevent violence on the part of Black nationalist groups, prevent military nationalist groups and leaders from gaining respectability. We believe that Fred Hampton fit the FBI definition of a Black messiah who could unify and electrify the Black nationalist movement. They had mentioned that Dr. King could be such a person, that Elijah Muhammad, Stokely Carmichael. But we think Fred was targeted because of his ability to organize. And so this was somewhat of our theory. And then we discovered, wait a minute. One of the things we discovered was that prior to the raid, the FBI had sent an anonymous letter to Jeff Fort, the leader of the Blackstone Rangers, who was the most powerful and well-armed gang in Chicago. And they sent a threatening letter to Jeff Fort saying, this is on a blank piece of paper, not FBI stationery, saying, I'm just a Black brother. I've been hanging out with the Panthers. They got a hit out on you. I know what I'd do if I was you. So it was a direct invitation for the Blackstone Rangers to basically kill Fred Hampton or the Panther leadership. They did not believe that the Black brother who signed it was real, but it showed the intent of the FBI to use any means. The documents up here is what we call the O'Neill informant document. And O'Neill, after the raid, you can see the date on this, a week after the raid, O'Neill was given a bonus, the informant, from Hoover, saying it is felt that the information is of considerable value, the information he provided, the floor plan, in consideration of a special payment. So the informant was given a reward after the fact for the murder of Fred Hampton. This is Flint and me a few years ago when we tried this case, standing in front of the Panther office. We were pretty young. Going back to the case a little bit, after 18 months of trial, while the jury was deliberating, Judge Perry dismissed the jury, granted a motion to dismiss, and said there's not enough evidence to go to the jury. This was while the jury was deliberating. And he not only decided the case for the defendants, dismissed our case and assessed costs of $100,000 and an appeal bond. And that was what we had to show for 10 years' work. But somehow I think the spirit of Fred and Fred's, words, dare to struggle, kept us going, and we got the court reporter to give us a break on the 33,000-page transcript. We filed an appeal to the Seventh Circuit. we signed the brief, Power to the People. And we got an amazing opinion that not only said there was enough evidence to go to the jury against the FBI and police, but the FBI's hiding of documents, and that's a whole other story about how much they did give us and how much they didn't. We could use that as evidence of guilt. And also both Flint and I were held in contempt, each spent a night in the MCC in orange jumpsuits in trial for contempt. I was cross-examining Hanrahan, the prosecutor, and I said, didn't you make a deal with the head of the grand jury that they wouldn't date you and your men and you wouldn't expose the FBI role? And the judge wouldn't allow them to answer that. And I said, Judge, you can't cover up the cover up. And he said, Mr. Haas, you're going to jail. So they took me out of the court the marshals did, and I spent the night in the MCC. But anyway, eventually we did get reinstated. We settled the case for $1.85 million. And then I think the story, and I think it's the probably most well-documented case of a FBI government-ordered assassination. And also, Flint has continued at People's Law Office. I was one of the lawyers up at Standing Rock. This is me 4 years ago, where the pipeline attempted to go through right next to the Standing Rock Reservation. And I'm just going to show you one more thing. And you've been sent an article that came out literally today in Truth Out. And last month we uncovered new documents, or a friend asked for information and got Roy Mitchell, the special agent's personnel file. And this is one of the documents in it. And it basically says it's from Roy Mitchell. It's to Roy Mitchell, the agent from J. Edgar Hoover, you can see. And it's recommending that Mitchell get a $200 bonus for his role and his use of the informant. And he's directing the head of this special agent in Chicago to make sure that Mitchell got that bonus. And the other two people at the bottom are higher up FBI officials. One is named Sullivan, and he was the same FBI official who sent those tapes to Dr. King, supposedly tapes of him having an illicit affair and telling Dr. King, if you don't kill yourself, we're going to send these tapes around. So the Cointelpro targeted Dr. King. They also targeted Fred Hampton, and we think they were responsible for carrying out the assassination of Fred Hampton. So anyway, thank you. I hope I've left some time for questions, and if there is, I'll be glad to give my email address. If people have any more questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeffrey. So at this time, we want to encourage everyone to write any questions or comments in the chat box, and we'll be addressing those. And then I thought I could start us out. So, you know, I think one of the things that you addressed in your presentation, Jeffrey, is the way in which the Hampton or the Black Panthers were portrayed, largely as a Black separatist, aggressive organization, a violent organization. But a lot of their work and a lot of their resources actually went into programming, like the Children's Breakfast Program, like the free health clinics that they provided at the time. And so I just wonder, you know, what have been some of the biggest, you know, some of the false notions or perceptions that you were hoping to address in the book?
Well, first of all, I wanted to de-objectify Fred himself, because he was known as this militant Black leader who had a great speaker, but also that had been killed in a 4:30 a.m. raid by Chicago police. I don't think I explained that. Police officers dressed in plain clothes in a People's Gas van came at 4:30 in the morning and broke in and knocked, and then came in shooting. So it was well known in Chicago, and not only, you know, what happened to Fred, but I wanted to, who was he? Why was he special? And why was his sense of justice such that he was willing to risk so much and be so outspoken? And I thought getting a little bit into the life of Fred Hampton would inspire all of us the way he inspired the people who heard him and saw him. And as I said, he was, he had the ability, my Flint Taylor had him speak at Northwestern Law School, and we expected there'd be 10 or 15 people there. There were 300 people in the auditorium, including law professors and law students, and they gave him a standing ovation. So I think I wanted to show how broadly Fred and the Panthers did have outreach. And it was also a period when the world was in revolution. Dr. King talks about that in his speech. Which side are we going to be on? Are we going to be supporting dictators, or are we going to supporting the people, which we just have seen an administration that supported dictators all around the world. So I really wanted to personalize Fred and also show what the Panthers did and talk about the breakfast program, the health clinic, the selling of newspapers, the speaking events, all of which were very much what the Panthers did. And their ability to mobilize young people was very exciting at the time. So yes, the Panthers spoke a lot of truth to power, and a lot of people felt like listening and doing what the Panthers did give them a vision of a different society, of a society that did provide the basics for all people, and obviously for Black people, but that would mean for everybody. So all the contradictions of that society and the world, and another connection you see so quickly when you watch Dr. King's late speeches and you hear Fred, is this sense of internationalism, that our solidarity is with people around the world, not with, and so our militarism has, and our military budget has both oppressed people around the world, but it's also prevented us from providing the domestic programs. The Panthers, the government couldn't provide a breakfast program, but they could provide napalm for Vietnam. Or the same as Dr. King pointed out, we can't have a real poverty program if we're putting billions of dollars into arms that we're using in the Vietnam War. So I think I wanted to show that there was a movement that excited and dramatized a lot of people, and that meant some of which has been picked up by Black Lives Matter movement. Both movements focused very much on police brutality. Police control, community control of police was one of the Panther demands.
And I want to make sure you have a chance to stop sharing your screen, if that's okay, just so we can get folks back on
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
the screen here. We want to make
yes.
sure your
Sure.
privacy
Okay,
is
I'm
protected
sorry.
as well.
Yeah,
No,
that's much better. Thank you.
fantastic. So in that vein, you know, I think that what's really exciting, your book, the movie that's coming out, for example, about Fred Hampton, Albert Wood Fox's book, several Panthers have now either stories, they've written their own story, or there's been more that really has come out in terms of the full account. I wonder what you think are some of the lessons for both organizers and activists today in the life and legacy of Fred Hampton, and maybe the Chicago, even more than that, the Illinois, the Chicago chapter of the Black Panthers more broadly in the fight for freedom today.
So I think young people today have picked up on the legacy of Fred Hampton, because I think he stands out as somebody who fought for fundamental rights and who stood up as a beacon for what the society should be. And so his name has come up a great deal in Black Lives Matter movement. And another thing I think I had noticed is that the Black Lives Matter movement doesn't have a single leader. And I think in many ways that makes it less vulnerable. And so they say they're leaderful, not leaderless. And so I think not having as such a hierarchical, and certainly not having such a patriarchal system makes it harder for the government to either destroy or defame, kill, or imprison them, because they are a very strong movement. But I think the Panthers awakened this sense of, and of course it was the period when people came out and talked about Black power. And I think there's a connection between Black power and Black Lives Matter movement. In both cases, they're making a demand they're saying, making a statement. They're not asking for civil rights. They're saying this is who we are. And this is what we're demanding: control over our own lives, over our own destiny. And we want people to recognize that. So I think people see in the Panthers that spirit, that energy, that demand that also speaks to the situation today. I don't know if there's a lot of people are in the waiting room. I don't know, is that true or is that just on my?
Oh no, I think everyone's in.
Oh, okay, good.
But we have a question, which I think is a great one. You know, talking to law students and future lawyers, what are some of the things that either lawyers can do or folks can do kind of immediately in terms of reducing police abuse or abuse in law enforcement or the criminal justice system broadly?
Well, I think these are demands of a lot of Black groups, Black Youth 100, Black Lives Matter. I think the Laquan McDonald case in Chicago was really an example of the community getting behind and demanding justice, and not only, and it led to the resignation of a mayor and a police chief and a prosecutor. And people were in the streets, and people were and followed it to court. So I think supporting groups that are demanding police reform, that are demanding resources go to the community and not to more and more police. I think it's really important. Obviously, doing civil rights work, exposing police brutality works. But one of the things we found was that, it was somewhat disheartening. We'd bring a case for a victim of police brutality and we'd get a settlement, or we'd win, and we'd win a lot of money for the city. But the policeman never had to pay any of that. And so we found that police would continue their patterns of misconduct. So I think that people have to really demand accountability and control of police, support of demonstrators who are out there bringing civil rights cases, supporting Black demands generally. So I know everybody's not going to be a civil rights lawyer, and there are other ways that you can contribute as a lawyer to changing this system.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder, just in terms of your career and working with activists and working with movements, like what are some guiding principles in terms of being a lawyer who works with the Black Panthers, or being a lawyer that works with water defenders at Standing Rock, and what are some of the experiences and lessons that you've learned from that work?
Well, I think in many ways I've gotten more than I've given. I think being in contact with people who are in struggle, who are really trying to bring about fundamental social change for a more equitable society, for a less oppressive society, just gives my life meaning, both personally working with people like that, but being up at Standing Rock, seeing this tremendous encampment of 10,000 people dedicated not only to protecting their water in the Missouri River, but protecting the planet, protecting our environment. And we just saw yesterday for the first time that Biden says he's going to take away the permit for the KXL pipeline, a real victory. Also, I've seen what together now, you see a coming together of the Black Lives Matter movement, of the anti-military movement, of the pro-Palestinian movement, and the water protectors, Native American, indigenous movements. The environment movement is not just for white people who are tree huggers. It's about the survival. It's about sovereignty. It's about taking leadership from people who see their connectedness to the environment. As one of the people says, we are not people protecting nature, we are nature protecting itself. And if we see that vision of being part of what we're protecting and our connection to it rather than how we exploit it, I think it gives us a whole different view of what our role has to be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And part of, in that vein, I wonder, in going from, representing the Panthers to thinking about Standing Rock and the many activists and organizers who were arrested at Standing Rock, how, if at all, have you seen state repression, political repression change?
Well, almost immediately. Well, first of all, we saw it escalate at Standing Rock. Some of you may have seen the early scenes when people tried to stop the bulldozers who were bulldozing the sacred sites. And when people, I was there that day when people went over that fence to stop the bulldozing, and the local police released those dogs, you know, and you felt like you're in Birmingham. They had dogs. The people driving the bulldozers were in pickup trucks, and they had shepherds and other Doberman pinchers in their cars who attacked the crowd who was trying to stop the bulldozers from their sacred sites. And then that escalated, though, and we saw more and more armored people. We saw drones, we saw helicopters and planes, surveillance, tear gas, rubber bullets, sound cannons, percussion brigades, this tremendous increase. We also learned at Standing Rock, and many of the tactics, many of the armaments at Ferguson were also reused at Standing Rock. The use of these heavy armaments, these mass machines, percussion grenades that can be very, very dangerous, and rubber bullets. And we also learned at Standing Rock that the pipelines had hired a private security company called Tiger Swan that had grown up in Iraq. So you have this collaboration between corporations, the police, and this private security company. I think that, and then of course, most recently at the Capitol, we've seen collaboration, infiltration of the police department, probably of the Capitol Police, and more by the right wing, which we just saw evidence of a week ago. So I think it's one picture, but.
Yeah, and I wonder on that point, like, what's your reflection in terms of how Black bodies or Indigenous bodies are treated when they are, you know, exercising First Amendment rights, and kind of comparing that to the violent storming of the Capitol that we saw just a few weeks ago?
It was absolutely striking. You know, at Standing Rock, when you'd get people who were not violent, who were trying to protect their land, and you'd see this mass gathering of law enforcement in these riot uniforms with all these weapons, with drones and all of that, and then who grabbed people and beat people and arrested people and put them in cages there, compared to the primarily white people at the Capitol. A friend of mine is with Veterans for Peace, and 2 or 3 years ago, they said, we're going to have a rally at the Capitol. And when they got there, and many of them, probably the majority, are older white men, but maybe they had 200 or 300 people. The police had extended their barriers 100 yards out from the Capitol. No one could cross those barriers. Anyone who did, you know, but nobody, you know, they were afraid of any kind of people coming in. But here, these were white people who were claiming their loyalty to Trump. And I think many of the police were mixed, if not infiltrated. And yes, if those Black people had stormed those doors, I think they would have been shot, if not taken and beaten, and all kinds of things used against them. So it's striking, the different way that those white supremacists in DC were dealt with, and Black and brown and Indigenous people are dealt with when they protest.
Well, I just want to give you a chance for any closing remarks. I want to thank you again for joining us today and for really leading us in this conversation and sharing your experiences with Fred Hampton and what he meant for so many people in honor of Martin Luther King.
Well, I'm honored to be there. And I just want to say to the law students that, you know, when you have a life to live, make what you do important, something you like, something you believe in, something is bringing about progressive change that's helping people. we do have power as lawyers, both to represent and speak out for our clients and to make some changes. And so remember Fred's words, dare to struggle, and also use your law in a way that you feel proud of yourself, proud of what you've done for your clients, and proud of the mark and the change that you're able to make in society. And I remember Dr. King, remember Fred Hampton. You come on the backs of a lot of great people. And I think now is a moment in society when we really have to decide which way we're going. King said that in 1968, but it couldn't be clearer now. Which way are we going to go? Are we going to have free healthcare, no student loans, or healthcare for all? We're going to have a more egalitarian society or a more authoritarian, unequal society? And what role are you going to play in that?
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. I really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone for organizing this event and everyone for joining us and participating. I hope you will reflect on what we just heard and have a good semester moving forward.